afternoon, and welcome to Friday. We've made it through another week, and we're looking forward to the weekend. But first, we're going to talk about ZEISS Conversations. We have got a special guest with us today. We're going to talk about food photography, commercial photography, and all of his history leading up to what he's doing today. And without further ado, let's meet our guests. As always, you've got our ambassador friends here, Tracy Page and Kenneth Hines. They're ZEISS ambassadors and are joining us in the conversation today. Our special guest is food photographer Joe Glyda. He's joining us today. We're going to talk about his career and some of the things that he's done, both commercially as well as food photography. And we might just dip into some aerial photography as well. So, welcome, everybody.
Hello.
Oh.
Hey.
So,
You said you weren't putting me in the center square again today.
it just ended up that way. So
like-
next time we'll have Wilma in the center square, and
I have to
we'll-
do something funny being in the center square. I have to like come out of the square or something.
We'll have
You're in
it
the
like
center
a
of the pyramid.
we'll have an all pets conversations day.
There we go. Wilma the Wonder Dog will be the center square.
That's exactly right.
And Wilma has found a lap right now, so she's not with us.
Awesome. So welcome, Joe. We're glad to have you with us. I know if you want to give us a little bit of your background and what kind of photography you're shooting and a little bit of your history, that'd be great.
Sure. Thanks. Thanks everybody for having me. I am a food photographer. I actually started at Kraft Foods back in 1974 in the mailroom and kind of worked my way up into the darkroom. And then after the darkroom, moved into the studio, and one of the photographers asked if I had ever used a view camera before. And I said, no, what's that? And he said, you put this hood over your head and you look at everything upside down and backwards. And I thought, no wonder photographers are crazy. This is the way they've been looking at the world their whole life. So I took 3 images and I was all on 8x10, put them up on the light box. And then that Monday morning, we had 9 staff photographers at the time. And they walked in and they're like, did you shoot these? And I was like, yeah. And they're like, wow, these are really good. And I'm like, really? And they're like, oh yeah. You know, Professional Photographers of America has a contest and you should really send these in. So I sent them in. Well, I had no idea they were pulling my leg. I did all this stuff and I was all excited about getting these in. And about 3 months later, I get a letter from PPA and they said, we'd like to use one of your images on our cover. And we'd also like to do a picture of you talking about this new up and coming food photographer. Well, I can tell you, I pissed 9 guys off really fast. But my dad was an amateur photographer, and so he had all these magazines, and I pretty much just grew up around photography my whole life. And so by the time I got to this position, it just was like second nature. I would just put things in, and they worked out great. So I became, one of their senior photographers. And then in 1993, I got the first digital camera and saw my first retouching in 1986 on a Cytex machine. And I thought, man, this is unbelievable. We need to do this. And I guess my problem was I was always taking that beautiful transparency and they would print it and it would come back all orange or all yellow in the magazine. And I was like, what are they doing to these? And I just wanted more control. So by going to digital, I found out we had so much more control over the film that was being, sent out to the magazines. Mm-hmm. So I switched over in 95, stopped shooting film in 95. And for about 2 years, Kraft was like half digital and half conventional. And we did that. And then in 99, we completely went all digital. And was shooting there till about 2009. I took her an early retirement after 36 years and pretty much worked on everything from cookbooks to national ads. I did NASCAR for a while from 2001 to 2009 because Kraft sponsored all these race car drivers for Roush Racing. And it was amazing. It was just a great career. I moved from Chicago to Tulsa, Oklahoma, which I know was kind of a shock to some people, but just loved coming down here to Tulsa and just continued my career down here. And I'm still shooting to this day. And I just love it. I just love photographing food. There's just one thing about food it's just different every single day. You never know what you're going to be doing.
Which is how I got to meet Joe, is because he moved to Tulsa, Oklahoma, and he moved to some close to mutual friends. So I got to, and so now he gets the honor of living among these really great people, and I miss out all the way here in Georgia. But I just think, Joe, I just think your work is phenomenal, and you set the standard for food photography. And for those of you who don't know, Joe came out with a book this year on food photography. And Joe, where is that available?
You can get it on Amazon. This is what it looks like.
And just it's like the textbook on how to do this. And we see so many people doing food Instagrams, food blogging. They're showing their food, they're photographing food, they're teaching food photography, but they don't know what Joe knows. And we thought it would be a really interesting conversation today to try to pull some of this information out of the master. He was, of course, at Kraft for 36 years, and he's continued since he's left Kraft to be the preeminent food photographer here in the States. And Joe, tell us a little bit, let's talk about your process. Let's start there. Tell us a little bit about how you set up and what you're doing, what you're using.
Well, right now I'm using Sony cameras and the Sony equipment. I was on Nikon for a while and then went to Fuji, which I really loved Fuji, but when they stopped making the S5 Pro, I went back to Nikon, was really impressed with that. But when Sony came out, and I talked to a few people who were using Sony, and they were like, Joe, you've got to look at this camera. You've got to check it out. I checked it out and I was just blown away. It was just amazing. So for all my food work, I'm using the 7R3 Sony camera. And for my aviation, I'm using the A9, which has a 20 frames per second. So when I'm shooting air to air, I can get a lot more images, and you have to get that propeller just in the right place. One of the things I want to talk about just really quick on the book, one of the things that I was looking at, I looked at a lot of photography books that were dealing with food, and there was a lot of fluff. And I didn't want a book with fluff. I didn't want full pages with, double page spread of just food. And I shot this at f/16 at a 30th of a second at ISO 100. It was like, there were so many of those big pictures. Like, I wanted to get more in detail and understand what was inside getting the food. I mean, from picking the food at the grocery store by yourself, working with clients, working with a food stylist, working with customers. There's just so much more involved in it than just pretty pictures of food. I wanted to really give an intense look at even some of the tools that we use to make sure, the macaroni looks perfect on the spoon. I know that sounds crazy, but we turn every noodle so that you don't see the little eye facing, because if the eye faces you, you're going to get distracted. And I want to keep your eye on that spoon. So it's little things that we do like that. That make it so important.
Okay, so a little bit, let's just into the technical a little bit. We know you're shooting with the Alpha R3 or the Alpha 7 R3 and the A9 on your lenses. Tell me, I mean, you don't have to mention brands and stuff, but just tell me in general, what lenses do you use to photograph your food with?
Yeah, the good stuff.
90% of the time, I'm going to use a 100mm macro lens.
Okay.
Fixed macro lens. And the other times I'm using a 90mm tilt shift. And the reason I do the tilt shift is because I want everything as sharp as possible. Now, I know this sounds crazy and people will be like, yes, but selective focus, that's what I really want. Well, it's great when you're just photographing just for yourself. But when you're photographing for a client, I think there's that one shot that I sent with the beef, little pork. I think they're like pulled pork.
Yeah, yep.
You'll notice that the front's nice and focused and the ones behind it are soft. So I photograph that as sharp as I can all the way through. The reason being, if you photograph it exactly like that and the client comes back and says, can I get that second one just a little sharper? You're not going to be able to do it. If it's all sharp, you can control how much focus goes farther back. So if they want that second one to be a little sharper, you can bring it up a little sharper. I'll tell them, go get a cup of coffee and I'll work on it and come back.
So the blur you're adding in post then?
Yes. And I'm using the lens blur filter in Photoshop.
That's an interesting way to see.
Right.
That's not something we typically run into. So that's a really interesting tip.
Right.
So
what I do is I'll build an alpha channel with a gradient on it, and that'll give you your transition from sharp to soft. And then you can move that position anywhere you want to create your focal point. And then that creates that depth that you really need. But if they come back and say, I don't like the way that's so soft, I can control that and change it. If I've shot it like that, I'm done. It's that's
exactly.
it anymore.
Exactly.
So I like having more control over the whole image.
So your image needs to be as accurate as possible coming out of the camera, as sharp, tack sharp as possible, color accurate. And color accuracy was another part of this topic. You were talking about using an X-Rite. Tell me about what you're doing for color accuracy.
X-Rite color checker. I use the X-Rite color checker at the beginning of every single shot. Anytime you change your light source, not light position, but every time you change your light source, you want to take a shot of that gray card or that color checker to make sure you get all the colors. And they have a software where you can actually target your camera and it knows all those colors, and you can go back and use that as a profile for your camera. So in food photography, especially when you're working for a client, there is a specific color that they have on that food. So you can't go in and enhance. I can't make that macaroni and cheese look even more orange because it's already orange, but you can't really make it more orange because that's the true color of what the product is. So by using the color checker, I can accurately keep my colors correct all the way through.
Okay, and so in that instance too, it's when you're using different types of cameras and you're using different types of lenses, you're going to get different results. And so in doing that, you're kind of taking that away because you're going to get what you need color wise when you do that check.
Exactly. It's kind of like taking a stake and putting a stake in the ground and say, okay, this is gray, this is white, this is black, this is gray. And anything around that gray is going to be the correct color. And that's one of the reasons I was having a problem with film. I don't know a lot of people know this, but if you processed a shot on Tuesday and you process a same shot on film on Friday, the film on Friday would usually look a little bit warmer. And it's usually because the guys in the lab were wanting to get out of there faster. And it was like 10 o'clock at night. They're trying to get to the bar. So they crank up the developer just a little faster to get those sheets of film to go through a little faster and would change the color a little bit. But a lot of people don't realize that. And now you have more control over that color, exactly what you need. We did a test.
You're controlling it now instead of somebody in a lab.
I'm controlling it. Yep. And one of the things we did with I'll never forget this. We photographed a napkin when I was first getting into digital. I had this little dish of food with a green napkin, and the green napkin was lime green, and I mean really lime green. And I had one of the photographers photograph it on 8x10 film. He shot it, sent it out on a Friday. That's when I wanted him to do it, on a Friday, because I knew the film would come out more yellow and more red. And sure enough, when they brought the transparency out, the napkin was avocado green. It wasn't lime green, but it matched the film exactly. I mean, I had them do a proof and the film came back, and I never ever showed them the real napkin. And then I photographed that napkin with the gray card and the color checker, and I made sure that my colors were right on. I had them make another proof according to my digital file. They looked at it, they brought both proofs up, and they looked, and both proofs were avocado green. And I said, well, I noticed that this is avocado green napkin is the same. And he said, yeah, it's exactly the same. We're really impressed with the color on this. And I'm like, oh, really? And I said, so how did you get the color of that napkin? And he said, well, I have the transparency here. This is the real color. And I reached down in the bottom of the drawer and I pulled out the lime green napkin and I dropped it on the table, and everybody was just like, I'm like, no, this is the real color of the napkin. So by having that color checker, it really makes a difference to keep your colors accurate.
Awesome. And one thing you had mentioned about the two lenses that you primarily use, like what tilt shift lens are you using? And then for your macro lens, is it very important to you as far as what the magnification rate for that specific lens is, or?
Not really, because a lot of the times I'm not actually using the macro part of the lens, but it's the 105. And the tilt shift, I'm actually using a Canon 90mm tilt shift lens.
Okay.
But I just got the adapter to put onto the Sony, because
Yeah, I'm using an adapter too. I use it the same way.
Nobody's using the Sony doesn't have a tilt shift yet. And I've used both. I kept my Nikon 105mm macro, and I'm still using that sometimes, as well as the Sony 105 macro. So it just depends.
Tell me a little bit of, I'm sorry, go ahead, Ken.
Oh, I was just going to say, that Nikon macro, I've seen images from it. Does a really good job. So.
Beautiful. It's sharp. Oh my gosh, it's sharp.
So tell me a little bit about your lighting setup.
Yes.
Okay. I know this sounds crazy, but I always ask my students, how many suns did God make in this galaxy? One. Okay. Right? So I use one light.
Wow.
One light, and I use it from behind, always backlight. Once in a while, I'll do a side light, but 90% of the time, I'm using a backlight.
I like that. So it's like it's a window behind.
Well, not only so much a window, but it's just, when you think about when you sit down to eat, where does the light come from? Does it come from underneath here? Does it come from behind you? It's normally coming towards you. And that's usually when you're photographing something, you want to be able to see what that food, and what's so great about backlighting on food is it creates a highlight on the top of the food and creates a shadow at the bottom. And it gives the food a place to rest. So if you'll notice, I think I sent some little cupcakes with little raspberries and stuff on top.
Yep. Yeah, I think those are up now.
Yeah, when you see that, you just see how that highlight comes across and the shadows are sitting there and a place for those cupcakes to, it makes you want to just reach in and grab one.
It really does. That's how come I had to make sure I ate before this, because I'm like, the photos that you take just look so desirable.
So are you using, what size modifier? Is it a big modifier or a small modifier? Is it a softbox?
It really depends upon the food. One of the things I talk about, and I know Tony Corbell talks about this all the time, it's, you have to figure out what you're photographing before you can light it. You don't just grab a modifier and throw it up and say, okay, I'm going to use this. So if I have I think I have a little tiny melt away with a little lemon curl. I actually used a really small softbox and I got it really, really close. And by doing that, I can actually create a little bit of a side backlight to create just that perfect little highlight along the top of that piece of chocolate. And it's really important to change your modifier. One of the things that I tell my students when I'm teaching is walk around your subject. Before you ever put a light up, or before you ever put your camera up, put the light up, put your product or whatever you're photographing on the table, and then walk around and look and pay attention to what the light's doing, what the shadow's doing. So even though I'm using a backlight, I'm using 2 small fill cards. They're just pieces of cardboard that I have folded up. I have some that are white and gray, some that are white and black. And I just fold them. They're like 9 by 12, put pieces of tape on them, and they kind of surround. So even like when you're outside, the sun comes and hits the earth, there's other things around the earth that's bouncing that light back into the subject. That's exactly what's happening on the food. You get that light to come across the top, off the back, and then the fill cards will bring that ambient fill light back into the product.
So it's not like you just have the one light source from the light. You're using your bounce cards or fill cards to bring it back toward the front as fill, which is really, really lovely. Are you ever using subtractive light?
Sometimes, but not. What I do is I'll just back those cards up. I'll just use whatever the light's doing. And then a lot of times I'll have to get a little bit of an extra punch of light in somewhere. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people will just grab another light. I'll grab a mirror, or I'll grab like a little card that's got aluminum foil on it, and I'll just move it closer. And now I can actually pinpoint that light right to the source where I want it. Subtractive light. I got a great idea for that, because I actually did a piece of cake one time, and they thought that the cake itself was too bright. So I took a glass and I filled it with tissues, like Kleenex.
Oh, wow.
And I just moved it right next to the cake, and the light is still hitting everything, but that little glass with the tissues in it blocked just enough light to give me a little bit more texture and control of light on the front of that cake.
I was
I
going to
think
ask you.
subtractive is so important.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I was going to ask you, as far as when you're doing the food that you are, and you said that the lighting kind of changes based on what you're photographing. Do you actually go about choosing how the lighting is produced for those photos based on what you feel the image should look like, or what that particular food item should kind of have in terms of lighting? Or does the client tell you specifically how they want this lighting? How do they want the food to kind of resonate in the image? Is that kind of a collaborative thing, your decision, or more so 100% the client?
It's really collaborative, but what the thing is, you have to make sure you pay attention to the client. The client is, and in my case, if I'm working for a client, I'm actually working for the art director.
Okay.
Because the art director has gone to the client and say, here are my 7 ideas of the concept that you want, and they pick one of them. They say, this is what we really like. So then that art director brings that to me. It's my job to fulfill that and make sure that exactly what he's looking for is what he's going to get, because that's what the client has actually asked for. Now,
That's something I think a lot of people don't realize, is that your art director actually directs this, not us.
exactly.
They come up with the concept. It's our job to fulfill what they've come up with.
And I tell people all the time, when you're in portrait photography, you are selling that portrait to someone in that family back to them. In commercial photography, the product is the hero. And whatever the client wants, that's what you need to make sure you're paying attention to. So it's really important. I think there's a shot of caramel apples that I did. And this is a perfect example of what the client wanted. The client told the art director he wanted something very light, and he wanted these caramel apples on a very cream colored background. And when the art director got there that day, I had this piece of plexiglass that was pumpkin orange. And I mean, it was as bright as orange as you can believe. And he's like, that is not what I want. And I said, I know it's not what you want, but this is what you're going to get cream colored. He goes, there's no way. And so when I slid this bright orange background and then lit from behind, that light that's hitting that reflective surface, you can notice on the front of the edge of the plate, that's the real color of that plexiglass. It's bright orange. But because the light is reflecting onto that bright orange, it turned it into cream colored. Right. And when we slid the image into the layout, I thought he was going to pee in his pants. He was like, how in the heck did you do that? So there are things that we know how to do to get them to make it work for the client. And they might not necessarily understand how we're going to do it, but it's really working with the art director and really working with the client to give them what they want.
We got 2 good questions that actually are very so much great to ask at this time. From David Glenn, number 1 is, do you use a large diffuser for your images?
Yes, if for something like that with that caramel apple, that's like a 6x9. It's really big and it's right over the top. So all you're actually seeing in that image, you're actually seeing the light box reflected into the bright orange plexiglass.
Okay. And the second one that he has is, do you stage the food yourself?
No.
Great point.
I use what's called a food stylist. And most times, a lot of times the people are going to want to use a chef. And chefs are great. Don't get me wrong. I love chefs. I just think they do a great job, but they make the food for people to eat, not for people to look at. And a really good example that I give is if you take a plate and you tell a chef to put the food in the middle of the plate, they're going to put it right in the middle. But when you look at it from this angle, it appears that the food is way back here. So a food stylist takes into consideration where the camera angle is, where the plate is, and they'll move the food forward in the plate so that when the camera sees it, it actually makes it look like it's in the middle. So the food stylist makes the food according to where the camera angle is.
Now, do you hire the food stylist or do they get hired through the ad agency? How's the team work?
I usually hire the food stylist, especially because I know who I've got to use or who's good at what they do. It's really important. Probably the hardest food to photograph is pizza.
Wow.
It's not ice cream like everybody thinks. It's actually pizza.
Is it because of like the assortment of colors that you have involved there?
It's because they want it to come out perfectly hot and piping like it just came out of the oven. But can we move that pepper and move that pepper and move that onion and move this and change and move that? And they want to do all that before they can pull the cheese and get that perfect pull. So we actually have to have a pizza puller to stand in there and wait for us to say, okay, we're ready, go. Pull up, pull up, pull up, pull up, out, 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 turn, twist, shoot, done. Get another pizza. You can't put the pizza back in and start again. You get one shot at it.
Oh, wow. I love that.
So that's one of the hardest things to photograph.
Do you have a favorite of what you've done in your career? What has ever been kind of like your favorite subject in terms of food to photograph?
I love desserts because then I can eat them afterwards.
That was going to be another question. Like, do you actually get to consume the stuff that you're photographing?
Yes.
Well, this leads us into the whole discussion too about, we were talking about this a little bit earlier before you guys joined us, but one of the things Joe told me a while ago that really stuck with me is that the food needs to be as real as possible. So Joe, let's talk about that a little bit, about the reality of what we're doing.
Yeah, when I started at Kraft, there was a lot of buzz going on because allegedly 2 college students were eating Campbell's chicken and stars soup one day in their dorm. And they were going through a magazine and they came upon an ad for chicken and stars. And they were like, well, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense because our noodles are all sitting at the bottom and their noodles in the ad are all sitting at the top. And so they got a group together, hired a lawyer, and called themselves SOUP, Students Opposing Unfair Practices. And this lawsuit, when you read the story about the guy who was doing all this, you read the whole story, the 2 students were never ever named. They were always redacted in the document. And then one day they found out that it was a competitor that was trying to get them in trouble because it's really false advertising. And I don't know if you remember the Volvo commercial where the big giant truck went over all the cars and the Volvo stayed completely still, but that's because they had crash bars inside the car. It's false advertising. So when I started at Kraft, everything was, you have got to be by the book. So you can't take a bunch of saran wrap and stick it inside of a 1-quart bowl or a 2-quart bowl and then fill it with 1 quart of liquid or whatever it's going to be and then say it's, it fills a 2-quart bowl. Because 90% of the stuff that Kraft was doing was for recipes. And so you had to make sure that when someone was, putting that recipe together, what they were going to end up with was what they were going to see. So you had to make sure that everything was, called out, especially pizzas. If there were 18 pieces of pepperoni, you had to make sure 18 pieces of pepperoni were on there. You couldn't put anything less or anything more. So it's a matter of just making the food as real as possible to get it to look right. And that's done with lighting and timing. I know there's a lot of stuff on Facebook, talking about using motor oil for syrup. You just can't do that. You can't do that.
Might start a new phenomenon.
A lot of things out there. There's a lot of information out there about how to fake the food shots, and they just, so one of the things I thought were so important from Joe is that these companies really spend a lot of time and effort to actually make sure that the food is as real as possible, is really what they're serving. And I just thought that was so interesting, because I had sat in on other programs before where they taught us how to fake things. And then here's Joe going, no, 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 we don't do that. We really don't do that.
Right, right. And even to this day, even after I left craft, I pride myself. And if the food doesn't look good, I'll tell the food stylist, no, I take it back. We're going to do it again. It's got to be done again.
Well, the other interesting part of that component that you said earlier was exactly the components you could use. You know, that there may not be, if it didn't have a parsley or cilantro in the recipe. I'll let you continue with that thought.
Right. And when you're working with a recipe or you're working with ingredients, you are only allowed to use those ingredients. You can't go in and say, well, you know, I feel like green parsley would be perfect for this, or green cilantro. You can't just put it in because you feel that it's going to be good. And I know a lot of photographers want to have their own look and their own style. But again, it's not about us. It's about the product. And if the product doesn't have green cilantro in it, you don't put it in. So like I was telling you before, I'm working with a dessert right now that's just milk, caramel, and cookies. That's it. And they're all the same color. And they want it to be more colorful. And I can't add more color to it, but I have to use my lighting, and I have to use the caramel a certain way and maybe put it in the shadow so that I get more of a little highlight on the caramel, and then maybe a little piece of cake and maybe a little milk pitcher in the background to create those different feelings to kind of get you to keep on the image.
Our mutual friend and chef from France, Walter Eggleton, is in the room.
Hey, Walter.
We love Walter. Is the food always piping hot when you photograph it? That's from Walter.
Most of the time, yes. I usually try to time it so that as soon as it comes out, it's ready to go. Because if it doesn't look that way, you're going to be able to tell. Now, you can, a lot of times what you can do is we'll use a spritzer, just water spritzer, and you can put that on meat, you can put it on vegetables, you can put it on, as long as it's edible, you can spray it on the food to keep it looking moist.
And that was another question that David
Right.
Glenn just asked, was about gloss agents for shine. So you're using water spritzer.
I'm using water. Now, there are times that I actually have used a couple drops of glycerin, but the problem with the glycerin is it's really sticky. And if it goes somewhere where you don't want it to go, it takes so long to clean that up. With water,
you just...
I use little makeup sponges, and we can take the water off and redo it. You can always redo the water. You can't always redo the glycerin.
I love the accuracy, the painstaking accuracy of what you're doing.
And like I said, working with a food stylist, I mean, there are some food stylists that are just, they know where I'm going to be. If they don't think I'm going to like it, they'll be like, what do you think of this? And I'm like, it's good, but I think we need to do it just a little different.
It sounds like you work with a food stylist the way I work with a hair and makeup stylist.
Exactly.
So to add on to that,
go ahead.
For the food stylist, I swear I always get the questions of people's names I can't pronounce. So you'll see your question. Did you hire a food stylist from early on, or did you try yourself until you were able to hire one? Any advice for someone who can't hire one, but they're trying food photography?
Okay, advice for people just starting off: always use a food stylist. I am getting to the point now, 43 years later, that I'm sometimes not having to use a food stylist, knowing how much I have to do. If I was just photographing cookies last week, and I know I can just dust those off and I don't need a food stylist to do that, but I know how to do it. But you don't want to do that when you're starting off, because you should be worrying about taking the picture and not worrying about the food. You need to worry about lighting, composition, design. You need to worry about all that when you're starting off. If you're starting off and you want to just try some stuff, hire a food stylist and talk to them and say, look, I am starting a new book. I want to do some food photography. Is there something that you'd like to try? Is there something that you haven't done yet that you'd like to kind of go, and we'll both have a shot for our book. And sometimes you can work out a deal with a food stylist so you both benefit.
Okay, awesome. And Tony Corbell, hey Joe, what is your favorite F-hole number?
I told him he had to ask a question, so that's what he came up with, huh?
My best one is 45, Tony. 32 and 45. Shoot as sharp as you can.
45. That's awesome. He's good for harassing all of us.
Yes, he is. Yeah, he's a dear friend. So
Yeah, he can be intimidating too because he knows so much.
There was one shot that I have in there that I did for a cancer company that does food for cancer patients. It has all the different dishes in it. If you can pull that one up, that was something that they did not want to hire a food stylist, and they only had the chef. And they were adamant about it. And we talked about it, we discussed it. And I said, okay, I will do this. So we went ahead and did it. And some of the stuff that he brought out, I was just appalled that he thought that looked good enough. I think there's a slice of like an apple tart with some apples. I just told him, bring the whole pie out. And I took the whole thing apart and rebuilt it on the set while and he couldn't. I had X-Acto knives and I'm cutting all the things and I'm laying them so the light was all hitting just perfectly. It was just amazing. And when we were done, he goes, I don't know how you did that, but that looks delicious. And this was going to be used in the movie theater where they wanted this, again, talking with the art director, they wanted to show 3 dishes and then 7 dishes and then all the dishes. So they wanted it to like build. So I said, let's put everything in the shot. And she said, no, you don't understand. I want to start with 3 and then 7. And then I said, I understand what you want to do, but we have to put them all in first. And she couldn't understand why I was doing that. And I said, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put everything in first, get all my composition, and then we'll start pulling stuff out to get to the 7 and then pull stuff out to get to the 3. So you have a good balance of composition. If I start putting 3 in and then I put the next 7 in and I have to move something, then they're not going to be all lined up. So this way we put everything in first, took a couple dishes out to get to 7, then took the rest of the dishes out to get to 3. And then it made the perfect buildup. So it was a complete perfect dissolve when they came on the screen.
Yeah. And, that's a good example of showing how, someone might see things this one particular way, but because this is something that you do and you understand of what they're wanting to do, but this is the best plan to execute what you want. Because had you done it the way that they wanted it to be, it would have been very different once they compiled it together. So that's a great example of sometimes you kind of have to, I guess, put your foot down because it's like what the client wants, but this is the best way to actually get what you want in terms of the results.
Well, that's one of the things that I love about being a commercial photographer is that you're a problem solver. You have got to solve a problem. This is what they want. How am I going to get to that point?
Right.
So I've got to make sure that I do it the best. I had one art director came in and he wanted a fisheye look, but the way he drew it, there's no way a fisheye could do that because he had the fence going like this. And if you did the fisheye, it would be out that way. And so I had to recreate the whole fence in Photoshop and I shot it exactly the way he wanted it. And when he saw it, he was like, oh no, that's not what I want. And I said, oh, you want this? And then I showed him the fence the other way. And he's like, oh, that's exactly what I was looking for. So that was another point I was going to bring about working with an art director. And I've done this many times. I'll be sitting I always use 2 monitors. So I have my regular monitor and then a bigger monitor. And I usually let the art director sit in front of the bigger monitor. I want him to see the image as big as possible. And one day we were talking and I said, boy, this is really a cool layout. And he goes, oh, and it's not. This is the worst layout out of the bunch. And I'm like, what do you mean? He goes, this is what they picked. And it's just stupid. I don't even know why they picked it. And I said, well, do you have those other layouts? And he said, sure. And I said, well, if we have extra time tomorrow, I want you to bring one of those layouts in. Let's see what we can do. Maybe we can work on one of those. So he brought in 2 or 3 other layouts. And I said, what's your favorite? He goes, this one. And so we shot exactly what the client wanted from the art director. And then we photographed what his idea was. And we got it all down. We put it together. And oh my gosh, the client came the next day and they hated the shot that they wanted. And the art director just kind of looked at me, like gave me that like little, and I was like, oh, you want me to show the other one? He goes, yeah, let's show him that one. And he says, we came up with this. And he put it up and they were like, oh my gosh, that's perfect. That's exactly what we're looking for. They totally forgot that they hated that layout. But now that made me look good to the art director. And he was more than happy to work with me again after that.
I think that's so important that we're making the people we work for are heroes. We're not trying to be the heroes. We're making the people we work for be the heroes.
Exactly. And you always, and especially when I was at Kraft, there would always be 4 or 5 people behind me, you know, usually from marketing, and they would be like whispering, you know, I wish you would move that plate to the left. And while they're talking, I'm paying attention to what they're saying, and I'm moving things. And then all of a sudden I would hit the screen and they'd be like, I'm like, do you like this? And like, oh yeah, that's great. Had no idea that I was listening to exactly what they were saying. My favorite part is I call it the fork, ring around the fork. So I'll put a fork in position on the plate, and then I'll look at it during what I call dummy food. So I'll have the food stylist make what's called dummy food. They just throw the food on the plate, no styling, nothing. Just give me an idea of what the food is, and I'll put it in, get my lighting set up, get my camera set up, and do all the composition and put things in. It's really a series of positions that you try, different compositions, different design, try different things to make that food look just right. But I'll always notice the fork is here, and I'm like, oh, I wonder if I put it over here, and I'll shoot a shot of that, and I'll move it over here, and I'll shoot it in. And by shooting tethered, nothing else moves except for that fork. And I'll move that fork all the way around, and then I'll put it right back where I had it. And inevitably, someone will come down and say, I really don't like that fork there. And I was like, oh, well, how about if we put it over here? And I'll show them the dummy shots, and I'll be like, how about if we put over here? No, I don't like that. How about here? No, I don't like that. How about this one? No, I don't like that. And it's going around the plate. And in the final one, they're like, ooh, I like that one. I go, that's exactly where we have it. And you hit the button and it shows the real food with the fork in the right place. And they're like, oh, yeah, I like it there. I like it there. So you make it seem like it's their idea, and it usually works out to your benefit.
So Tony Corbell is like being my same brain here, because he's asking the same question that I was going to ask you next, which is, tell us about tethering and working with the client on site.
Okay. Tethering, I've been shooting tethering my whole life. Ever since I started going into digital, I've always shot tethered. The main reason is by shooting tethered, I never have to keep picking the camera up and getting everything exactly in the same position. If it's on a tripod and it's locked in and you're tethered, I can move things all over the place. And if I ever have to go back to where I was, I can always go back to that position, move everything exactly where it was, and then move forward and continue on. But if you do that by handheld, you're wasting a lot of time. And also if you're, shooting to a card, you're taking the card out and you put it in and you're downloading it, then you're downloading it. And a lot of people use Wi-Fi. I just, even with something like this Resume, I'm hot wired right to the internet. It's so much faster. It just makes life so much easier.
So
you're not only shooting tethered, you're shooting on a tripod, you're shooting tethered, and you have the client's ability to immediately review what you're doing, which I think is very interesting.
Exactly.
Because you are trusting your client instead of saying, no, you can't see this until we're done. You're trusting the client to direct you.
It's their idea. It's his or her idea that we're trying to make this work. And if they're not happy with it and they walk out, they're not coming back. So I make sure that what they're seeing, they're like, wow, look at that. Oh, I like that. We don't have to go any farther. We've got that. Let's move on.
So when you're doing something like that, you mentioned about, if you had to transition, holding a camera and all of this stuff, if you had to take out your memory card. I know with a lot of agencies, time is very important, because that's money being spent. So about how much time do you spend on average for the projects that you're doing? How much is it, going through is it a day? Is it a couple of days? What's kind of the time frame when you're doing that?
It's usually a full day. I mean, it depends upon what you're photographing. I mean, the most shots we're going to do in a day, like for say a restaurant, or I do a lot of stuff for a company here in Oklahoma called Made in Oklahoma. And it's all food products that are made in Oklahoma. And we will tell them right up front, we can get 7 shots done today, because you're doing dummy food, you're setting up, you're moving things around, you're changing sets, you're going from vertical to horizontal, you're going from up above, looking down, changing your light source or changing your light position constantly all the time. So normally 7 shots. And one time we got done with 7 shots and we were done by, 4 o'clock. And she just looked at me and was like, maybe we can get another one in. I was like, today went very well, but you remember the last time it was 7 o'clock when we left and we were still on shot number 6. So it just depends on, how easy the client likes everything and how you're doing. My favorite story working with them was that strawberry shortcake that I sent you. We were doing 7 shots that day. And on the very last shot, we were looking into this strawberry shortcake, and the food stylist was really having a difficult time to get all the layers to be straight. So some layers were like this, some layers are like that. And he's trying to push strawberries in to make sure they look, nice and even. And the client was standing right there. We didn't have an art director at that time. It was just a client. And she said, would this be a good time for a down shot? And I looked over at the food stylist and he's going like this. No. This is the last shot of the day. I'm not going to change everything and start all over. I'm like, absolutely. Sure. We moved the table out of the way. We've got some wainscoting, put it down on the floor. I just took the whole tray, put it on the floor, got some strawberries, moved around, brought the light way down, brought the camera above and did the shot. And she absolutely loved it. Just thought it was, and he didn't have to worry about the cakes being straight, but that it worked out absolutely perfect for what they wanted to do.
So after all that handling, did the cake still taste good when you ate it later?
He didn't eat that one.
There's only so much handling that our brains can take.
If it's sitting out for too long, you're just like, I'm not sure.
Yeah, no, that cream doesn't look appetizing to me anymore. Yeah. What was your, Michael Mowbray, by the way, said that we are giving him ad agency PTSD. So sorry, Mowbray. And happy birthday, Michael. We were wishing him a happy birthday. Lemons, for whatever that means. We don't remember anymore. And what is your favorite? Which one has been your favorite to eat afterwards?
Usually the chocolate I get from Belgium. That's been the best. Do you remember when they were going through those? There were some bomb scares for a while, and
yes.
they were thinking that it was coming out of Belgium. Well, we ended up getting a package, and all the chocolate desserts were all completely scooped out because they thought they were explosives.
Wow.
We had to call them and say, "This is what we got."
Oh my God.
I'm sure that the dog sniffer was like, something's really good in that box.
Hopefully the dog was not sick afterwards. Dogs and chocolate. I know that's
yeah, I know that's not a good thing.
Michael said thank you. So is there a good way? This is from, I know I'm not going to get this right, Hak Yong K Chon.
Yeah.
What would be a good way to start exposing yourself to commercial and the food industry?
Okay. Start with something simple. And if you don't have a lot of equipment, that's fine. Start by going to the store and pay attention to what's on the packaging. So here's something that I tell a lot of my students. If you're looking on the website for food ideas, that's a great idea. But like 70% of the people that have food sites haven't even been in business for 3 years. So you're looking at stuff that somebody just kind of thought, oh, this looks good and I really like it, and they put it up there. But if you go to the store and you look at packaging and you look at the displays in the store, someone actually hired a food photographer to do those. So their composition, their design, their way of putting the food together is a combination of the photographer, art director, and client. And if they look at stuff like that and say, I want to replicate that, or I want to create that look, the best thing to do is, start with the fruits and vegetables, and go to the produce department and look for what you think are the best looking, grapes or cherries, and just work with that. And then bring those home, use window light. Think about the old painters, how they would use window light. They didn't have big soft boxes. They didn't have fancy lights. They didn't have fancy cameras. They had a canvas and they just put the food on a plate in a bowl with a drape, and they painted that. And that's pretty much, what you should do. If someone has, your mom bakes a cake, a perfect bundt cake, photograph the bundt cake. Get a cup, like I think there's one with the lemons in there. Just put some lemons in and try to photograph something that you have in your house. Go to Starbucks, get a couple of really cool desserts and photograph them, and learn to see. You really want to know what the food will do after a certain amount of time. And the reason I say start with fruits and vegetables, they will last all day. The cake might not. The desserts from Starbucks may not. They'll start to get condensation on them. You'll start to get little drops of water, and you're like, how do I get rid of that? And you don't know. So use like apples, pears, bananas. Just go to the grocery store. And I talk about that in my book. I talk about how you go to the store and look for things and how to pick them. Look for things that don't have blemishes. Look for apples that have the little leaf in them. That's always gold. If you can find a little leaf from a pear or an apple, take that home, put it in the bag. And then I normally have the grocer make sure if they're going to put it in bags, I put it in separate bags so they're not all just thrown together. You want to make sure that you just bring everything home and sort it all out and get it nice and wet, clean it, and then get your set ready, get your camera ready, use window light if you have to, and just start composing and seeing how it works.
So you mentioned that for a beginning photographer, somebody just starting out with not a beginning photographer, beginning in food, that, you can use a window. Do you ever use, somebody asked this in the question earlier, do you ever use window light in your shots commercially?
No, because I've learned to use light to make it look exactly like a window. The problem you have with a window light, I don't care if it's a north light window, and I can't tell you how many times I had, Kraft was always saying, well, how can an in-house photographer know what he's talking about? This guy cannot be that good. We have this guy who's got a special studio with special north light windows, and he only shoots daylight. So they would always do a test between 3 photographers, 2 outside photographers and myself. And I'm telling you, 9 times out of 10, they always picked my shot because I can control the light so much better. If you want to create daylight, get rid of the softbox. What is the sun? It's a little tiny point of light way up in the sky. Take your light, put it all the way up in the ceiling, and shine it down on your food. You have daylight. It's so simple.
I want to get to a question from Walter Eggleton again, but just real quick from me, do you prefer that harsh light or the softer light? What quality of light do you prefer?
I like the softer light. I think you have more control over that. The harder light will give you a certain look. If you want to be outside and you want to have that look, but most of the time, if you're outside, you're still going to have bright sunlight, but you're going to sometimes be in shade. You want to create that same kind of look.
I think this is
you can make it look like that way.
I think this is a great question from Walter. What determines whether you add elements to a shot, such as extra strawberries in the shortcake shot? Any hard and fast rules?
There aren't any hard and fast rules, Walter. I'm sorry.
We can't give you the magic answer.
It really depends on, like, if that was going to be a square shot for an Instagram, I probably would have used maybe 2 strawberries, but it was a horizontal and they were using it for a horizontal website. And part of that top of that cake was going to get cut off. So by using the strawberries in the bottom, I even think some of the strawberries at the very bottom are going to get cut off. So it's like using a couple different variations, which way they could use it. And sometimes I will try to put less than more.
And someone had, I guess, a good kind of closing question from John Coop. And this is probably a question that I myself would ask you. And because Tracy knows how I am, I'm a little brutal sometimes with things. What is the main key to food photography? Is it lighting? Everyone is a food photographer now with cell phones. What makes you stand out from the rest? And I think that's just an awesome question to ask you right now.
Well, if I tell you my secret, then everyone will be a food photographer.
That's a true point.
It's backlight, and it's learning to turn your phone upside down when you take a picture of your food. Turn your phone upside down.
So one of the things, I know we're getting close to needing to wrap here.
Wait a minute. Did he say turn it upside down? I don't understand what he meant by that.
Yeah, you got me on that one.
Okay,
I'm
so if
sitting
you
here going,
photograph something, you normally take your phone, you hold it up like this. So the lens is up here, and that's normally what everybody does. and they just photograph the food and they're shooting down. If you turn the camera upside down, the lens is down here. You get a totally different perspective. You would never go down here and try to shoot something of your food. But if you turn your camera upside down, it changes and forces the perspective to be at the bottom. It works great in bars when you're talking to people like, that's a really cool drink. And they're like, oh yeah, I just took a picture of it. And I'm like, oh, turn your camera upside down. They're like, oh my gosh, it's beautiful.
We're gonna have to try that as soon as we can find an open bar.
Mowbray says that there are only 2 copies of your book left on Amazon. So it sounds like you're about ready for
not true.
reprint.
Amazon does it all the time.
They're trying to create urgency. We're
Yes.
trying to help you do the same thing. Order fast. One of the great points that Joe and I had talked about before, which is just something we wanted to bring up before we close today. Joe, let's a moment about in this period of COVID and sheltering in place, we talked about how we need to approach clients. Can you elaborate a little bit?
Yes. I mean, there are so many people are itching to get back to work and that are struggling with money. And I totally understand that. But this is not the time to be hounding your clients. Like, what more can I do? What more can you give me? What more can you give me? Now is the time you should be calling your clients and asking them, how can I help you? How are you doing? You have to build that relationship and keep that relationship going with your clients. It's so important. So many people are so anxious and ready to just jump in on it. And it's like, I just want to call them. I've called all of my clients and say, hey, I just want to check and see how you're doing through all this. Is everything okay? How are you been? How are things going? What are you, how you feeling? Where are you at with this? And no political stuff. It's just strictly, how are you feeling? How are you doing? I'm here for you. If you need anything, call me. That's all. We have to be there for each other, and it's the only way you can do it.
I just think that's such an important message in this time where we're all struggling with, lack of income or lack of work. And it's just, we have to remember to be kind to each other and to be concerned. And
Right.
it's just not all a me kind of personality. It's reaching out and saying, hey, we're here. What can we do for you? How can we help you? Are you okay?
Right.
And I think Joe was even putting the "are you okay" first before the other. That was just so important for us to call people and say, "Are you okay?" This is a great
And
message.
for myself personally, it's like start doing stuff for yourself. I know they always say, learn a new language. I'm doing something that I never thought I would do, is like learn a new software while I'm in a new project. And I'm like, I am writing a book on World War II airplanes. And this has been the perfect time for me to be locked up in a room because I hate writing. That's why I became a photographer. I hate writing. I hate reading, but I'm able to be quarantined to my office and just keep writing. So that's been really, it's been good for me in that respect.
Hey, I've been doing these webcasts. This is a totally different thing for me, and I appreciate you doing this with me. David Glenn did just ask, is the hardcover the same as the paperback? Do they have 2 different covers?
Get the paperback. The hardcover is like twice as much, but because it's a book company, they sell that to schools, and the schools get a discount for the hardcover books. But it's better. It's the same book. It's the same information in both.
And for those of you who are signed up for Texas School of Professional Photography, Joe's class is already sold out. So you lucky dogs. I was going to pimp that today too, but it's already
I'll be
long
teaching
gone.
at West Coast School in San Diego next June.
I'm going to have to find some place to come take a class with you and hunt you down. I just had the privilege of getting to speak myself in Oklahoma, where Joe is a member, and got to be Joe's kind of dinner companion. So it was a lot of fun.
It was great.
It was. That was really great. Leslie treated us all very well. So Oklahoma, hats off to you. You guys are amazing. Joe, do you have any closing thoughts for us? Anything else you want to leave us with?
Just keep being creative. We are creative people. We find ways to do things that regular people do not know how to do. We see things differently. We view things differently. We take things in differently. And it's just important to keep that creative, keep those creative juices flowing within you. Do whatever you can to just keep it up. And when we come out of this, you're going to be amazed at how much easier it's going to be to just get right back into the swing of things.
Absolutely. And those are excellent words for us to end on. Thank you, Joy. I appreciate it. Everything that you've talked about is fantastic. Some of the questions that we've seen today in the chat have just been really terrific. Thanks again to Joe Glyda for coming with us here and sharing his craft and his art. Some fantastic photos. I know I have to go get a snack now, so but that's
We
my
all
problem.
do.
Yeah, most definitely. Tracy and Ken, thanks again for being moderators and asking some really challenging questions and participating well. And thanks to everybody here who's showed up and who's going to watch this. Some really good words from Joe Glyda. Certainly, we want to say thank you to all of us, from all of us to all of you who are tuning in and joining us every week. You make this worthwhile for us to do, and we really enjoy it. So be safe, have a great weekend, and continue being creative. And we'll see you next week. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.